The scream tore through the canyon like a hawk shrieking in pain, sharp, wild, and impossible to ignore. Dust rose in shimmering waves along the red cliffs of the mesa, carrying her cry down to the valley below where townsfolk paused in their daily tasks. A blacksmith let his hammer freeze mid-strike, a saloon girl stopped pouring whiskey, and two ranch hands shaded their eyes, staring up at the ridge. Everyone heard it. Everyone looked, but no one moved. Sarah Whitfield clung to the jagged edge of Red Mesa, her hands bleeding from the bite of stone. At 30, she had thought she knew the shape of fear, had thought her years of widowhood, debts, and isolation had hardened her against it. But dangling over a sheer 100-foot drop, with nothing but sharp rocks waiting below, she learned that terror had teeth. Her nails split as she clawed for grip, her arms trembling with the weight of her own body. Help! Her voice cracked against the wind. The sun blazed overhead, turning sweat into stinging rivulets that ran into her eyes. She blinked, her breath coming ragged, chest seizing as she tried to cling to life. On the ridge above her, townsfolk gathered. Ranchers, merchants, even the sheriff faces she knew, faces that had once smiled at her, had once broken bread with her. Now their expressions were unreadable, some curious, others grim, some whispering to one another like spectators at a show. Shifal, not our problem, shouldn't have been wandering there. The words drifted down to her like scraps of ash. Sarah's heart broke even as fear pounded in her chest. They were not strangers. They were her neighbors. They had watched her bring pies to church, nurse the sick, teach children their letters. And yet, as her boots scraped against the cliffside, kicking loose gravel into the abyss, not a single hand reached for her. Her life had become disposable the moment her husband's debts swallowed their ranch. The bank had claimed the land, the townsfolk had turned their backs, and Sarah had become invisible. Now, even in her desperation, they left her to die. The stone beneath her palm shifted. Pebbles clattered into the void, their faint echoes swallowed by the canyon's throat. Her stomach lurched as her body dropped another inch. She bit her lip until copper flooded her tongue, praying, begging, that anyone would break free from the crowd's apathy, and then she saw him. The shadows of the cedar trees at the far edge of the ridge, a figure emerged. He moved with a swiftness that cut through the stillness of the crowd. A tall Apache warrior, long black hair streaming behind him like a banner in the wind, his chest bare except for the turquoise and bone that glimmered against his skin. His moccasined feet carried him with sure, quiet steps across the stony ground. Unlike the others, his eyes held no hesitation. He didn't whisper. He didn't weigh whether her life was worth the risk. He saw her, truly saw her, and in that instant, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years' hope. Her hand slipped again, skin tearing. A cry ripped from her throat, raw and desperate. She felt her strength waning. She couldn't hold on much longer. The warrior sprinted, a sudden blur of sinew and muscle against the fiery horizon. He flung himself down the slope, sliding over loose rock and gravel with a grace born of familiarity with the land. The townsfolk gasped but didn't follow. They watched as he descended, his steps precise where theirs would have stumbled, his body moving like part of the mountain itself. Sarah's vision blurred. Her arms quaked violently, tendons stretched to their breaking point. "Please," she whispered, more to the wind than to anyone else, and then his hand, calloused, strong, unyielding, it closed around her wrist just as her fingers lost their final purchase on the stone. Her body jerked downward, her shoulder screaming in pain as he bore her full weight. For a moment, she dangled between life and death, suspended only by his grip. The raw power in his arm trembled, but did not break. Sarah's eyes locked onto his face, bronzed by sun and shadowed by determination. His jaw was set, his breath even, his strength steady. Inch by inch, With a force that seemed to come from the earth itself, he pulled her upward. Gravel stung her cheeks as she scraped against the cliffside, her skirts tearing, until at last she collapsed onto solid ground. Her body pressed against his. The thud of his heartbeat was the only sound she could hear, loud and sure against his chest. She gasped for air, trembling violently, her cheeks streaked with dust and blood. Around them, the townsfolk stood in silence. No cheers, no relief, no gratitude. Only stares cold, watchful, full of something between suspicion and contempt. Sarah clung to the warrior's arm, the weight of her survival sinking in. The townsfolk had ignored her, but he had not, and that, she knew, would change everything. Sarah's palms burned as though they had been torn raw by fire. The ache in her arms lingered, throbbing deep into the marrow even after she collapsed onto the rocky ground. For a moment, she could do nothing but clutch the earth beneath her and gasp, each breath a ragged scrape against her ribs. Dust filled her lungs, her throat, her eyes. She coughed, tears mingling with grit until the world blurred. Then came the steady sound of breathing stronger, calmer than her own. Sarah raised her head. Takoda knelt beside her, his hand still gripping her wrist as if unwilling to release her until he was certain she was safe. His chest rose and fell evenly, muscles taut beneath skin bronzed by sun and scarred by battles past. His long black hair, wild from the run, swept forward like a curtain as he bent closer, his turquoise and bone jewelry glinting faintly in the fading light. For the briefest heartbeat, Sarah allowed herself to lean against him. His warmth was startling, his presence overwhelming. She felt the solid drum of his heart beneath her cheek and realized it was steady, utterly steady, while her own galloped like a frightened colt. But above them, silence held the ridge. The crowd of townsfolk who had gathered to watch her struggle now stood frozen in place, their murmurs swallowed by the canyon wind. Sheriff Mallory's hand hovered near the iron of his gun belt, though his face revealed no intention to draw. Beside him, the pastor shifted uncomfortably, eyes narrowed with something closer to disgust than relief. No one moved forward, not to thank Takoda, not to check on Sarah. Instead, a whisper traveled like wildfire. She should have fallen. Let the savage keep her. Wasn't worth the risk, the words pierced. Sarah worse than the torn skin on her hands. She turned her head slowly, meeting the eyes of people she had once called neighbors, faces that had smiled at her after church services, faces she had shared meals with. Now those same eyes were cold, dismissive, as though her survival was not a blessing but an inconvenience. Her throat tightened. She wanted to scream at them, to remind them that she had once been part of them, that she had baked bread for their suppers, tended their sick, taught their children to read. But her voice caught like a snared bird. The truth crashed over her with the weight of the mesa itself. They had already cast her out long before this fall. Takoda's hand remained firm on her arm. Slowly, deliberately, he helped her to her feet. She swayed, her legs trembling beneath her, but his grip was like iron, grounding her. When she looked up into his eyes, she found no judgment there, only a quiet strength, as if pulling her back from death had been nothing more than instinct, as natural to him as breathing. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. A ranch hand spat into the dirt. A woman clutched her child closer, as though Sarah were contagious. The air grew thick with something Sarah had felt before: hatred. Not toward her alone, but toward the man who had saved her. Takoda seemed unaffected. His gaze swept the crowd, steady and unblinking, a silent warning that though he stood alone, he was unafraid. The turquoise beads at his neck caught the light of the dying sun, glowing like tiny flames. "Come," he said, his English careful, deliberate. His voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of the earth. Sarah hesitated only a moment before nodding. Together they stepped away from the cliff's edge. The crowd parted reluctantly, their silence louder than any gunshot. Every step Sarah took was a rebellion. Her skirts were torn, her hands bloodied, her body aching, but she held her head high. She had been spared, not by those who shared her blood, her prayers, her customs, but by the very man they despised. That truth burned inside her, searing through humiliation and fear. As they moved beyond the ridge, away from the cold stares, Sarah dared a glance at Takoda. He walked with the quiet assurance of someone who carried his own storms, his own history, yet stood unbroken. She envied that strength, hungered for it. When the voices of the townsfolk finally faded behind them, Sarah released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The silence of the open land felt less cruel than the silence of her neighbors. Why? She whispered, her voice hoarse, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Why did you save me when no one else would? Takoda did not answer at once. His stride remained steady, his face unreadable against the orange glow of the setting sun. At last he said softly, "Because life is sacred. Even when others forget." Sarah swallowed hard, her chest tightening. In that moment she understood. The fall had not broken her, but revealed the truth. She had been abandoned by her own people, yet saved by a stranger. And that made him, this Apache warrior named Takoda, the only person in the world she could trust. The air on the ridge grew heavier with every step Sarah and Takoda took away from the cliff. The hush that clung to the crowd was worse than shouting, a silence sharpened by judgment. Dust swirled in faint eddies, stirred by boots shifting uneasily. Nobody reached out a hand, nobody offered comfort, and certainly nobody thanked the man who had risked his life. Sarah's body still trembled from the fall, her knees weak as though the earth itself had not yet agreed to hold her. Her palms stung with every movement, the raw cuts oozing into the folds of her torn skirt. She needed something, anything. A word, a gesture of kindness, proof that she still belonged to this town that had once been her home. But instead, the words began. "She should have gone over," a rancher muttered. "Would have spared us the shame," another hissed. "Look at her, clutching onto him like she's one of them." The cruelty carried easily through the canyon wind. Sarah flinched, every whispered insult cutting deeper than the torn skin on her hands. They weren't strangers. They were neighbors. People she had once fed, people she had sat beside in church, people she had buried loved ones alongside. Now, their faces looked at her not with pity but disdain, as though her survival was an offense. Her throat tightened. She wanted to cry, to scream that she hadn't chosen this, that she hadn't asked to be hanging over the abyss, praying for a savior. But even in the storm of her emotions, a deeper truth clawed through. They hadn't lifted a single finger. They had watched her suffer. They had let her dangle. They had chosen her death. It was Takoda who steadied her when she nearly stumbled. His hand closed gently over her elbow, guiding her forward. His touch wasn't possessive or commanding. It was simply, sure, solid. For the first time since her husband's death, Sarah felt anchored. "Keep walking," he murmured in his careful English, his voice a low rumble that carried both reassurance and warning. Sheriff Mallory stepped forward then, his boots crunching against the gravel. He was a broad man, his face creased by sun and age, though his eyes avoided Sarah and fixed instead on Takoda. His hand hovered close to the butt of his revolver, though he made no move to draw. "You've made your point, Whitfield," he said coldly. "You're still alive. Now let go of him." Sarah froze, glancing from the sheriff to the circle of faces surrounding them. Let go of him? Her hands tightened instinctively on Takoda's arm. If she released him, she knew exactly what would follow. They would push her back into isolation, into scorn, into the void she had been living in long before she ever hung from the cliff. She met Mallory's eyes, and for the first time, she didn't drop her gaze. "He saved me," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Not you. Not any of you. Him. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a sudden wind through tall grass. The pastor's face reddened, his lips pressed into a thin line. A woman near the back pulled her child behind her, muttering something about sin and shame. Takoda remained silent, his gaze calm, unflinching. The turquoise at his neck caught the fading light, casting a glimmer that felt almost defiant. The whispers grew uglier, louder. She's lost her mind. She doesn't know her place. Ungrateful widow let the savage keep her. Sarah's heart pounded, fury rising where fear had lived moments before. How dare they? How dare they decide her worth, condemn her survival, while she was still bleeding from the cliff's edge? She had begged for help, and they had turned away. Only Takoda had moved, without hesitation, without judgment. Her voice cracked as she spoke again, louder this time. If any of you had reached for me, I'd be holding your hand right now. But you didn't, she paused, her chest heaving. You left me to die. The words landed like blows. Some faces hardened in defense, others shifted with shame, but none stepped forward. Takoda's grip on her arm was steady, unshaken by the hostility pressing in on them. He guided her past the sheriff, past the muttering crowd, until they broke free from the ring of watchers. The sound of contempt trailed after them like a hound, but Sarah forced herself to keep her chin lifted. Her steps firmed out when at last they reached the quiet beyond the ridge. Sarah released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The open land stretched before them, wide and endless, its silence softer, kinder than the voices they'd left behind. She turned to Takoda, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. They hate me now. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was gentle, certain. They hated you before, he said simply. You just didn't see. The truth cut, but it also healed. Sarah blinked hard, her throat tight. She had fallen from the mountain, but it was not the fall that had changed her. It was the hand that had reached for her when no one else would. By the time Sarah and Takoda left the ridge behind, twilight had begun to soften the edges of the mesa. The sky bled with streaks of pink and gold, fading into the deeper indigo of oncoming night. Sarah's legs ached, each step a reminder of how close she had come to never walking again. Her palms throbbed, raw and swollen, but she forced herself onward, too proud to let her rescuer carry her like a child. Takoda walked ahead, his stride steady, sure-footed on the uneven ground. His silence was not the kind that demanded to be filled. It was the silence of someone who listened to the land itself. Every so often he glanced back at her, his dark eyes unreadable, but his pace adjusted so she could keep up. Soon, the low thunder of rushing water reached them. They descended into a valley where a river carved its way through cottonwood and willow, the current swollen with spring melt from distant mountains. The water glimmered silver beneath the rising moon, wild and untamed, frothing white where it slammed against hidden rocks. Sarah stopped short, her breath catching. The river looked less like water and more like a living thing, a beast determined to sweep away whatever dared step into its grasp. Memories of the cliff edge clawed up her throat. She shook her head, clutching her torn skirts. I can't, she whispered, the words spilling out before she could stop them. I'll be swept away. I'll drown. Takoda didn't argue. He studied the river for a moment, as if reading its moods, then stepped into the current without hesitation. The water rose to his knees, then his thighs, swirling and clawing at him, but his frame remained steady, rooted like an oak. He turned back to her, extending his hand, palm open. His voice was calm, low, carrying over the roar of the current. Come. Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears. The crowd's voices still echoed in her memory. Let her fall, let her die. She had begged for help and been denied. Now, here was this man, offering his hand again, asking her to trust him. Her body trembled as she stepped into the freezing water. The shock bit into her legs like knives, stealing her breath. The current grabbed her skirts, yanking them downstream with terrifying force. She gasped, stumbling, and panic surged she was going to fall, to be swallowed by the river's hungry mouth, but Takoda's hand closed around hers. His grip was firm, unshockable, pulling her upright before the river could take her. His other arm slid around her waist, anchoring her to him as he guided her forward. "Step here," he said softly, nodding toward a narrow stone hidden just beneath the surface. She obeyed, her feet slipping, but his hold steadied her. Inch by inch, they pressed onward. The water rose higher, soaking her skirt, numbing her legs until she could no longer feel her toes. Her teeth chattered, breath coming in ragged bursts. But Takoda's strength was constant. His body leaned against the current, shielding her, absorbing the river's fury as though he had walked this path 100 times before. Halfway across, she dared to look up at him. His hair clung wet against his chest, his skin glistening in the moonlight, muscles taut against the river's pull. His expression was calm, unwavering, as if the river's rage was nothing compared to storms he had already endured. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt safe. When they reached the far bank, Takoda lifted her the last few steps onto solid ground. Sarah collapsed against the grass, gasping, her body shuddering with cold. She pressed her palms to the earth, grounding herself in the simple truth that she had crossed. She was alive. Takoda crouched beside her, wringing water from his hair. He handed her a strip of deerskin, and she realized he was offering it to bind her wounded hands. His movements were quiet, deliberate, as though caring for her was as natural as breathing. Sarah's chest tightened. She had begged for help from her own people, and they had let her fall. But this man, this stranger, this Apache warrior had carried her through both stone and water. She whispered hoarsely, her throat raw. "Why do you keep helping me?" Takoda's gaze met hers, steady and deep. "Because the river does not ask who you are before it takes you," he said simply. "And life is worth saving." Sarah blinked, tears stinging her eyes, though she blamed it on the wind. She pulled the deerskin tighter around her palms and stared at the river they had conquered, together. For the first time since her husband's death, she realized she wasn't walking alone. The town was restless before dawn. By the time Sarah and Takoda crossed the last stretch of sagebrush into the main street, the bell at St. Matthew's had begun to toll, slow and heavy, dragging the townsfolk from their beds. One by one, doors opened, lanterns flared to life, and voices carried on the cool air. Sarah's heart clenched as she walked barefoot over the dirt street. Every face that turned toward her was one she had once known, neighbors who had borrowed sugar from her, men who had tipped their hats politely when her husband was alive, women who had invited her to quilting circles. But now their eyes were sharp, cold, filled with something like shame twisted into anger. They had watched her fall yesterday. Watched and done nothing. Takoda walked at her side, bare-chested despite the morning chill, his long black hair still damp from the river. His presence cut through the street like a blade. People shifted uneasily. Mothers pulled children behind them. Men muttered with tight jaws. The warrior's turquoise and bone necklace caught the first rays of sun, flashing briefly like fire, and Sarah realized with a sudden surge of pride that he was not trying to hide who he was. The bell tolled again, and the townsfolk clustered near the church steps, whispering like a flock of restless crows. At the front stood Reverend Colton, his weathered face set hard, his hand resting on the Bible tucked beneath his arm. He raised his voice above the murmurs. "Sarah, you return with him?" His words were thick with accusation, his gaze darting to Takoda as though the warrior were some unholy spirit conjured up by her fall. Sarah straightened, though her knees trembled. "I return alive," she said, her voice cracking but carrying. "Because this man saved me." A ripple went through the crowd. Some looked away. Others narrowed their eyes. Takoda stood silent, his posture tall, his gaze fixed on the crowd. He did not flinch beneath their stares, though Sarah could feel the hostility prickling like thorns around them both. One of the ranchers, a heavy-set man named Burke, spat into the dust. "We all saw you, Sarah. You slipped." "God's will," some said. "And now you come back dragged in by a savage?" Sarah's blood burned hot. "God's will?" she echoed, her voice trembling with outrage. "Was it God's will that you turned your backs while I begged for help? That you let me fall?" The bell tolled once more sharp, reverberating through the square like a hammer blow. The crowd shifted, shame flickering in a few faces. But others hardened, doubling down, unwilling to face the truth of their own cowardice. Reverend Colton's jaw worked. "This is no place for bitterness, child. You lived by some miracle. But we cannot let an Apache, his name is Takoda," Sarah cut in, her voice rising. Her hands, still raw and bandaged, shook as she lifted them. "And without him, I would be broken on those rocks right now or carried away by the river. None of you," her voice cracked, but she pushed through it, "none of you reached for me." He did. The silence that followed was heavier than any sermon. Takoda finally spoke, his deep voice calm, steady. "A river does not ask who you are before it pulls you under. A cliff does not care the color of your skin. Life is life." She was falling. I chose to hold on. The words cut through the air, simple and undeniable. For a moment, the townsfolk were children again, caught in a truth they could not argue. But Burke sneered, unwilling to yield. "Fine words, but you don't belong here." "She doesn't belong with you." Sarah turned on him, her chest heaving. "And where do I belong then? With those who watched me die? With those who whispered behind my back since my husband's grave was laid?" Her voice cracked into rawness, but it rang with something fierce, something unbroken. The bell ceased its tolling. The air felt suspended, caught between judgment and revelation. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman's voice, soft but clear, rose above the silence. "She's right." Heads turned. It was Mrs. Tiller, the midwife, her lined face pale but resolute. "We all watched. We all stood there. And he—" She looked at Takoda, eyes steady. "He did what none of us had the courage to do." A ripple spread, uncertain but undeniable. The crowd's unity cracked, splintered. Some muttered in disagreement, others bowed their heads, and for the first time Sarah felt the weight shifting, just slightly, in her favor. Takoda's hand brushed lightly against her elbow, grounding her. His silence spoke louder than their noise. The church bell loomed above them, silent now, its shadow cast long across the town square. Sarah realized this was no longer just about her fall from the mountain. This was about the soul of the town itself, what kind of people they would choose to be when the truth stood before them. That night, the town did not sleep. The silence of the church bell lingered in the air like a wound left unbandaged. Windows were shuttered, voices murmured behind closed doors, and the dirt streets of Dry Creek lay empty except for the restless wind that carried the smell of smoke from somewhere far away. Sarah sat on the steps of the boarding house, her bandaged hands clasped tight in her lap. She could still feel the eyes of the townsfolk, their glares sharp as knives, their shame as heavy as lead. Mrs. Tiller's defense had shaken them, but it had not erased the truth. They had watched her fall. They had chosen silence. And now they were being forced to live with it. Beside her, Takoda leaned against the railing, arms folded across his bare chest. In the moonlight, the turquoise beads and bone pieces of his necklace gleamed like sparks of fire. His long black hair stirred in the wind, and his dark eyes watched the shadows of the town with an unreadable calm. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice a whisper. "You should go. They'll never accept you here. They'll never accept." As Takoda turned his head slightly, the movement slow, deliberate. "And you?" he asked quietly. She swallowed, looking down at her bruised palms. "I don't know where I belong anymore." Her throat tightened. "Not with them. Not even in this town. I thought I was part of it once, but now I see it clearer." Takoda's silence stretched, but it wasn't cold, it was steadying like the earth beneath her feet. "At last," he said, "a river carves new paths when old ones close. Perhaps you are like the river." Sarah's lips trembled, caught between grief and a strange, fragile hope. Before she could answer, a shout broke the night. "Fire!" The cry ripped through the stillness, followed by the frantic toll of the church bell. The same bell that had condemned her that morning now rang out in desperation. Sarah jumped to her feet as people burst from their homes, panic rising. She could see it from the corner of the street, flames licking up the walls of the mercantile, sparks flying into the night sky. Men scrambled with buckets, forming a line from the well. Women screamed for their children. Horses reared against the blaze. The town was unraveling in chaos. Sarah turned to Takoda. For a heartbeat, she saw the same decision in his eyes that he had made at the cliff. At the river, he could turn away, leave them to their fate, let them suffer as they had let her suffer. Instead, he ran. Takoda sprinted into the inferno, his body cutting through smoke and firelight, shouting commands the townsfolk had no choice but to obey. His voice was deep, steady, louder than the panic. "Form tighter lines. Keep the buckets moving. Clear the horses away from the fire." Sarah followed, coughing as smoke clawed her throat. She grabbed a bucket, passed it down the line, her hands burning with each rough edge. All around her, faces were wild with fear, but Takoda's presence pulled them together like a rope binding loose boards. For the first time, the town moved as one. Flames roared, sparks showered, and the mercantile roof groaned before collapsing inward. The crowd screamed, but Takoda was there, hauling two men back from the falling beams just in time. His chest glistened with sweat and soot, his muscles straining as he lifted a half-burned beam to clear a path. Sarah's heart pounded, not just from fear but from something else, an awe that burned hotter than the flames. The same man they had called savage was now their strength, their shield. Hours passed like years. The fire was finally beaten back, leaving the mercantile in ruins but the rest of the town standing. Exhausted, blackened with soot, the people sank into the dirt street, gasping, coughing. Children cried into their mothers' skirts. Men's hands trembled as they set down empty buckets, and in the middle of it all stood Takoda, breathing hard, his skin streaked with ash, his necklace blackened with soot, but his eyes still steady, still calm. The townsfolk stared at him, not with hatred, not with contempt, with something else, something quieter, respect. Sarah's throat tightened as she looked around at their faces. This was the moment she had longed for all day, not to be vindicated, not even to be accepted, but for them to see the truth. The Apache warrior who had saved her life had now saved theirs, but the question lingered in the smoke-filled air, unspoken but pressing against them all. What would they do with this truth come morning? By sunrise, Dry Creek smelled of ash and wet earth. The fire was gone, beaten into smoldering heaps, but the smoke clung to the air like a ghost that refused to leave. The mercantile was nothing more than charred timbers and collapsed walls, but the rest of the town still stood, battered yet unbroken. Sarah sat on a water barrel near the well, her body heavy with exhaustion, her bandaged hands blistered from passing buckets all night. Around her, the townsfolk drifted in dazed silence, blackened with soot, eyes hollow from fatigue. For the first time since her fall, no one seemed eager to look away from her. Their stares weren't filled with judgment now, they were filled with something harder for them to swallow. Gratitude and shame. Takoda stood apart, near the ruins of the mercantile. His bare chest was streaked with ash, muscles taut beneath the soot, his long black hair tangled and wild from the fire's fury. His turquoise and bone jewelry was scorched in places, but it still gleamed faintly in the early light. He was sharpening a blade with slow, steady strokes, his eyes distant. He hadn't asked for thanks. He hadn't stayed for their approval. He had simply helped, because life any life was worth saving. Reverend Colton approached first, his Bible tucked under his arm, his face etched with lines deeper than yesterday. The crowd watched, breath held, as he stopped in front of Takoda. For a long moment, the only sound was the rasp of stone against steel. Then the Reverend cleared his throat. "You saved us." The words seemed foreign in his mouth, weighted with pride swallowed raw. "We all owe you our lives." Takoda didn't look up. "No debt," he said simply. "Fire burns all the same." Sarah's chest ached at the truth of it. The cliffs hadn't cared. The river hadn't cared. The fire hadn't cared. But Takoda had. Again and again, he had. The Reverend hesitated, then turned toward Sarah. "And you?" "We wronged you." His voice cracked like dry timber. "We saw you fall, and we—" His jaw clenched. He couldn't finish, but Sarah didn't need him to. The silence of the crowd was enough. She could feel their guilt, their shifting shame, their desperate hope that the fire had burned away more than wood, that it had burned away their cowardice too. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady but her voice firm. "Takoda saved me when you would not. He saved this town when he had every reason to walk away. You call him savage, but what does that make you?" Her words cut through the morning stillness like the church bell had cut the day before. "What does that make any of us?" The crowd shifted, faces dropping, some nodding faintly, others staring at the ground. Then Mrs. Tiller stepped forward, her hands trembling but her chin high. She set a basket of bread on the barrel near Sarah and said, loud enough for all to hear, "You both eat. You've earned it." It was small, almost laughably small compared to what had been taken from Sarah, compared to the weight of the truth Takoda carried. But it was something. The first stone laid on a bridge that had never existed before. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, staring wide-eyed at Takoda, whispering about the warrior who had lifted burning beams with his bare hands. Men shuffled closer, awkward, some nodding, some mumbling words that might have been thanks. Sarah watched it unfold, her heart torn between anger and relief. Change was slow. Change was fragile. But for the first time, she saw the possibility of it blooming in the ashes. Takoda finally sheathed his blade and looked at her. His eyes were steady, unreadable, but softer than before. "You have a choice now," he said quietly, her breath caught. "A choice?" He nodded. "To stay. Or to walk a new path." Sarah's throat tightened. She looked around at the town that had let her fall, the same town that had followed Takoda through fire. Her home, and yet not her home. Then she looked at him, the man who had caught her, guided her, carried her through both flame and flood. For the first time since her husband's death, she realized she wasn't bound to the past. She could choose. The sun rose higher, painting the ruins in gold. And in that light, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years. Freedom. Whether she stayed in Dry Creek or followed Takoda into the unknown, she knew one thing with certainty. She was no longer alone. And the town, scarred and humbled, would never forget the day an Apache warrior saved them all.